knee-deep in murky water, surrounded by disease-carrying insects, and fighting an enemy you can barely see through the thick vegetation. For thousands of World War II soldiers, this wasn't a nightmare. It was their battlefield. From the fetid swamps of Burma to the treacherous Everglades training camps in Florida, soldiers had to master an environment that could kill them just as easily as enemy bullets. Malaria, dysentery, trench foot, and deadly snakes were constant threats. But those who learned to adapt didn't just survive. They turned these hostile environments into tactical advantages. The Pacific Theater presented some of the most challenging swamp warfare conditions ever encountered. Islands like Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Guinea contained vast stretches of mangrove swamps, tidal flats, and inland marshes that stretched for miles. These weren't the romantic tropical paradises of Hollywood films. They were death traps filled with razor-sharp coral, hidden quicksand, and water contaminated with everything from human waste to rotting vegetation. In Burma, the monsoon season transformed entire valleys into temporary lakes dotted with islands of higher ground. British, American, and Chinese forces operating behind Japanese lines had to navigate these waterlogged landscapes while carrying full combat loads, often for weeks at a time. The Japanese, initially better adapted to tropical conditions, still struggled with diseases that claimed more lives than bullets. European theaters weren't immune either. The marshlands of Eastern Europe, particularly around Leningrad and in the Pripyat marshes, became battlegrounds where entire divisions vanished into the bog. German forces advancing into Russia discovered that their mechanized units, so effective on open ground, became sitting ducks in swampy terrain where tanks couldn't operate and supply trucks couldn't reach. What made swamp warfare particularly brutal was the combination of environmental hazards with active combat. Soldiers couldn't focus solely on staying alive in the wilderness. They had to maintain fighting effectiveness while dealing with conditions that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. Every step forward meant testing unknown ground that might be solid earth, knee-deep mud, or a hidden sinkhole that could swallow a manhole. The mental challenge was equally severe. Swamps disoriented even experienced soldiers. Landmarks disappeared in the uniform canopy of vegetation. Compasses became unreliable near iron-rich deposits. Sound traveled strangely through the humid air and dense foliage, making it nearly impossible to determine the direction of enemy fire. Many units reported cases of soldiers becoming completely lost just 50 yards from their own positions. Traditional military training proved inadequate for these conditions. Standard tactics, equipment, and even basic survival skills had to be completely reimagined. Soldiers accustomed to digging foxholes in solid ground had to learn how to create defensive positions in waterlogged earth. Units trained in rapid movement across open terrain had to adapt to environments where 100 yards of progress might take several hours. The supply chain nightmare added another layer of complexity. Standard military rations spoiled rapidly in the humidity. Ammunition corroded if not properly protected. Medical supplies became critical as minor cuts turned into infected wounds within hours. Even basic equipment like leather boots and canvas webbing disintegrated under the constant moisture and aggressive vegetation. Yet some units not only survived but thrived in these conditions. They developed techniques that would keep them alive long enough to complete their missions. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated safe passage versus deadly terrain. Most importantly, they discovered that the swamp, while dangerous, could become their greatest ally against an enemy unprepared for its challenges. Staying alive in swamps required specific knowledge, specialized equipment, and mental toughness that went far beyond normal combat training. It meant learning to move silently through water while maintaining combat readiness. It meant understanding which plants could save your life and which ones would kill you within hours. It meant developing an entirely new relationship with an environment that seemed designed to destroy everything humans brought into it. The soldiers who mastered these skills didn't just endure. They became some of the most effective fighters of the war, capable of operating in terrain that stopped conventional forces cold. Their techniques for navigation, shelter construction, food procurement, and disease prevention became the foundation for modern jungle and swamp warfare doctrine. Fighting in swamps meant dealing with problems that desert or mountain warfare never presented. Water was everywhere, but most of it was contaminated with parasites, bacteria, and chemical runoff from rotting vegetation. Soldiers learned to identify the subtle differences between merely dirty water and water that would kill them. Clear streams running over rocky bottoms were usually safe after purification, but stagnant pools covered with green scum were death sentences waiting to happen. The purification process itself became an art form. Iodine tablets were standard issue, but smart soldiers learned to pre-filter water through multiple layers of cloth to remove visible debris before chemical treatment. Boiling water in steel helmets worked when fuel was available, but fires had to be small and smokeless to avoid detection. Some units discovered that certain types of charcoal, made from specific hardwood species, could improve filtration when nothing else was available. Disease was the invisible enemy that claimed more lives than bullets in many swamp campaigns. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in every pool of standing water, creating clouds of infected insects that followed troop movements like deadly shadows. The Anopheles mosquito, primary carrier of malaria, was most active during dawn and dusk hours, precisely when military operations often required maximum alertness and mobility. Soldiers learned to recognize the early symptoms of malaria, the sudden chills, fever spikes, and crushing headaches that could incapacitate a fighting man within hours. Quinine became more valuable than ammunition in some units. Medical officers established strict protocols for taking anti-malarial medications, but supplies were often inadequate for extended operations in heavily infected areas. Dysentery spread through units like wildfire when sanitation protocols broke down. In swamp conditions, maintaining proper waste disposal became nearly impossible. Human waste contaminated water sources that other soldiers might encounter days later. The cycle of infection and reinfection could destroy unit effectiveness faster than enemy action. Trench foot reached epidemic proportions in swamp warfare. Unlike the frozen feet of European winter campaigns, swamp-induced trench foot involved bacterial and fungal infections that literally rotted flesh from bones. Soldiers discovered that the constant moisture created perfect conditions for aggressive microorganisms that could destroy tissue faster than the body could heal it. The preventive measures became ritualistic. Morning foot inspections revealed the telltale signs of infection, softening skin, unusual odors, and the dreaded appearance of white, spongy tissue that indicated advanced rot. Experienced soldiers learned to dry their feet whenever possible, even if only for a few minutes at a time. The swamp itself seemed designed to swallow equipment and men. Standard military vehicles became worse than useless. They created noise, required solid ground that didn't exist, and often became permanent obstacles when they inevitably broke down or got stuck. Tank units discovered that their armored protection meant nothing when the ground wouldn't support the weight of their vehicles. Personal equipment deteriorated at shocking rates. Leather boots lasted perhaps a week before the constant moisture and aggressive vegetation reduced them to useless scraps. Canvas webbing rotted through at stress points. Metal components corroded despite protective coatings. Weapons required constant maintenance to prevent jamming from moisture and debris. Radio equipment presented special challenges. The high humidity caused electrical failures in vacuum tubes and corroded contact points. Antennas became tangled in vegetation or were destroyed by the acidic water found in many swamps. Communication between units often relied on runners who faced all the hazards of solo navigation through treacherous terrain. Navigation itself became a specialized skill. Traditional landmarks disappeared in the uniform canopy of vegetation. Compass readings became unreliable near iron deposits common in swampy soils. The sun was often invisible through the thick canopy, eliminating celestial navigation. Many experienced soldiers reported becoming completely disoriented within sight of their own positions. Yet soldiers adapted with remarkable ingenuity. They learned to move silently through shallow water by feeling for solid footing with their feet before committing their full weight. They developed techniques for using natural vegetation as camouflage and concealment that were far superior to anything taught in basic training. The adaptation process was often brutal. Units that failed to learn quickly suffered catastrophic casualty rates from disease, accidents, and enemy action. But those that survived the initial learning period became incredibly effective fighters, capable of operating in terrain that stopped conventional forces completely. Food in the swamps required improvisation far beyond the scope of standard K rations and C rations that formed the backbone of military nutrition. The high humidity and constant moisture caused standard preserved foods to spoil within days of opening, even when soldiers followed proper storage procedures. Canned goods fared better, but the weight of carrying sufficient canned rations for extended patrols often proved prohibitive in terrain where every ounce mattered. Soldiers learned to supplement their diet with local resources, but this required knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death. Fish were abundant in many swamp systems, but catching them without proper equipment demanded creativity. Experienced troops discovered that improvised nets could be constructed from torn clothing or salvaged parachute cord. The key was learning which species were safe to eat and which carried parasites or toxins that could incapacitate an entire squad. Freshwater fish like bass, catfish, and various minnow species were generally safe when properly cooked, but soldiers had to learn to identify the subtle differences between edible species and their toxic cousins. Some tropical fish contain natural poisons that no amount of cooking could neutralize. Trial and error often proved deadly, so units relied heavily on local knowledge when available or careful observation of what local wildlife consumed. Plant foods offered another source of nutrition, but required even more specialized knowledge. Certain palm hearts provided excellent nutrition and were relatively easy to harvest, but soldiers had to learn to identify the right species and harvest them without destroying the tree's ability to continue growing. Coconuts were obvious choices when available, but opening them without proper tools required techniques that many soldiers had to learn through painful trial and error. Wild fruits presented both opportunities and dangers. Some tropical fruits were nutritious and safe, while others could cause severe digestive problems or worse. Soldiers learned to observe what local animals ate as a general guide, but this wasn't foolproof. Many animals could safely consume foods that would poison humans. Preservation of food became critical in the humid environment where nothing stayed fresh for long. Salt, when available from rations or sea-water evaporation, helped preserve caught fish and prevented the rapid spoilage that could waste precious calories. Soldiers discovered that smoking meat over small, carefully controlled fires could extend its useful life by several days, but the fires had to be virtually smokeless to avoid detection by enemy forces. The smoking process itself became an art form. Green wood from certain species produced the right kind of smoke without excessive visible emissions. The meat had to be cut into thin strips to ensure thorough penetration of the preservative smoke. Too little smoking left the meat vulnerable to rapid spoilage, while too much could make it inedible. Sleep in swamp conditions meant solving the fundamental problem of staying dry enough to rest while surrounded by water. Experienced units learned to construct elevated sleeping platforms using available materials like bamboo, fallen logs, and salvaged equipment. These platforms had to be strong enough to support a soldier's weight, while elevated enough to stay above the waterline during tidal changes or sudden rain. The construction techniques varied based on available materials, but the principles remained consistent. The platform needed solid support posts driven deep enough to remain stable. The sleeping surface had to allow drainage while providing enough comfort to enable actual rest. Most importantly, the entire structure had to be camouflaged well enough to avoid detection from air or ground observation. Mosquito netting became more valuable than ammunition in many situations. A torn net could mean weeks of sleepless nights and inevitable disease infection. Soldiers learned to repair nets with whatever materials were available, often using threads pulled from clothing or equipment. The netting had to be secured tightly enough to keep insects out, while allowing air circulation to prevent overheating in the tropical climate. Personal hygiene required constant vigilance and adaptation to extremely challenging conditions. Daily foot inspections became mandatory survival procedures, not just military protocol. Soldiers learned to recognize the early warning signs of trench foot, fungal infections, and bacterial problems that could progress from minor irritation to life-threatening condition within days. Keeping wounds clean in contaminated environments meant using precious medical supplies carefully and creatively. Even minor cuts could become infected quickly in the bacteria-rich swamp environment. Soldiers learned to immediately treat any break in the skin with available antiseptics. then protect the wound from further contamination with improvised waterproof coverings. Movement through swamps required completely relearning basic infantry skills. Soldiers learned to test depth and stability with long sticks or rifle butts before committing their full weight to uncertain ground. A single misstep into unstable mud or a hidden sinkhole could trap a soldier or even cause him to disappear completely. These survival skills proved decisive in actual combat operations across multiple theaters of World War II. During the Burma campaign, Allied forces who mastered swamp warfare techniques gained significant tactical advantages over Japanese troops who, despite their reputation for jungle fighting, often struggled with the specific challenges of prolonged swamp operations. The Japanese had extensive experience with tropical warfare, but many of their techniques had been developed in drier jungle environments that didn't prepare them for the unique challenges of waterlogged terrain. American and British units operating behind Japanese lines discovered that swamps could provide nearly perfect concealment for extended periods. Small units could remain hidden in swamp areas for weeks, emerging to conduct raids on supply lines and communication centers before disappearing back into terrain that conventional forces couldn't effectively search. The Japanese, despite their superior numbers and local knowledge, found it nearly impossible to root out these swamp-based guerrilla forces. The techniques developed weren't just about individual survival. They became comprehensive tactical doctrine that changed how military forces approached swamp warfare. Units learned to establish supply caches on elevated platforms throughout swamp areas, creating hidden logistics networks that could sustain operations far from traditional supply lines. These caches had to be carefully camouflaged, waterproofed, and protected from both environmental degradation and enemy discovery. Cache construction became a specialized skill. Supplies had to be stored in waterproof containers and elevated enough to survive seasonal flooding. The locations had to be memorable enough for friendly forces to relocate while remaining invisible to enemy patrols. Many successful operations depended entirely on the effective placement and management of these hidden supply networks. Small unit tactics evolved to take advantage of swamp terrain characteristics. Large formations proved ineffective in environments where visibility was limited to a few dozen yards and movement was restricted to narrow channels between impassable areas. Instead, military doctrine shifted toward independent squads and platoons that could operate autonomously for extended periods. These small units developed communication systems that didn't rely on radio equipment prone to failure in humid conditions. Visual signals using mirrors or improvised flags worked over short distances. Sound signals had to account for the way noise traveled through swamp environments. Some sounds carried much farther than expected, while others were completely absorbed by the vegetation and water. The defensive advantages of swamp terrain became apparent to forces who learned to exploit them effectively. Natural obstacles that channeled enemy movement into predictable patterns could be prepared with hidden positions and improvised weapons. Areas that appeared impassable to attacking forces often contained hidden routes known only to defending troops who had taken time to explore and map the terrain thoroughly. Training programs in rear areas evolved to include dedicated swamp warfare instruction based on lessons learned from combat operations. The Florida Everglades became an extensive testing ground where soldiers learned these techniques before deploying to combat zones in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. What had started as desperate improvisation by troops already in combat became systematic preparation for forces heading into swamp environments. The training programs replicated not just the physical challenges, but also the psychological stresses of extended swamp operations. Trainees learned to function effectively while dealing with constant discomfort, limited visibility, and the persistent threat of disease and environmental hazards. The mental conditioning proved just as important as the physical skills for soldiers who would spend weeks or months operating in these challenging environments. Medical protocols developed specifically for swamp warfare became standard throughout the military. Prevention strategies for tropical diseases, treatment procedures for environmental injuries, and evacuation techniques adapted to terrain where traditional medical support was impossible. Combat medics received specialized training in recognizing and treating conditions like advanced trench foot, tropical infections, and exposure-related illnesses. The long-term impact extended far beyond World War II. The techniques developed by soldiers fighting in swamps became the foundation for modern jungle warfare doctrine used by military forces around the world. Special operations units still train using methods developed by ordinary infantry soldiers who learned to survive and fight in some of Earth's most hostile environments. The soldiers who fought in these conditions represented a unique combination of individual toughness and tactical innovation. They didn't just endure impossible conditions. They learned to exploit those conditions as weapons against their enemies. Their ability to find food, maintain health, and continue fighting in environments that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen contributed directly to Allied victory in some of the war's most challenging theaters. In the end, success in swamp warfare came down to the same principles that governed all effective military operations: thorough preparation, rapid adaptation to changing conditions, and the determination to continue fighting regardless of how impossible the situation appeared. The difference was that in swamps, these principles had to be applied in an environment that was actively trying to kill you, even when the enemy wasn't.